Ring the bell. School's back in for France's 12 million pupils. And in a nation that prides itself on its state education system, plenty of hot topics, lack of teachers, exam reform, the skyrocketing cost of supplies for parents, and how to tackle bullying. What's dominated headlines in the build-up to this, the first Monday in September, the Education Ministry's ban on the abaya, the loose-fitting dress worn by some women in Muslim countries. Opponents contest its religious nature. Proponents insist it's only right to enforce the 2000 French law forbidding conspicuous religious symbols in school. A necessary measure? We'll examine France's version of secularism, with a term, laïcité in French, coined in the late 19th century when the Catholic Church at times rivaled the Republic's authority. Today, France is a nation of mostly lapsed Catholics. Instead, arguments over secularism tend to focus on Muslims, many of whom are no longer recent immigrants, but have been here for generations. Can France maintain its model while most of its neighbors embrace multiculturalism? Naturally, we'll ask which way public opinion is going and what the politics are ensuing. Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at France's dress code dispute. With us from Toulouse, Rim Sarah Alouane, researcher in comparative law at Toulouse Capitole University. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
He's a former high school teacher himself in Paris's working class northeast suburbs. Gabriel Attendu, associate professor, of English at Sorbonne Law School.
Good to be here.
Good, welcome back. Welcome back as well to an Englishman in Paris, Jeremy Stubbs, deputy editor at the French news website Causeur.
Good evening.
How are things?
Fantastic.
And we also have a Frenchman in London, by the way, Alexis Artaud de la Ferrière, lecturer in sociology at the Royal Holloway College. Your research all about France's tumultuous relation between religion and state over the years. Welcome to the show.
Happy to be here. Thank you.
The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation you have on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Dateline, the village of Saint-Germain-sur-Île, that's north of Rennes in France's northwestern Brittany region. The prime minister, flanked by her 34-year-old education minister, posed for the cameras on this, the first day of school. Less pastoral, the build-up with the ban on the abaya. Donald de Souza has that story.
It's one of his first major decisions as French education minister, and one that's likely to generate a significant amount of pushback. Gabriel Attal announced that abayas will be banned from public schools from the start of the academic year, claiming the government was testing France's secular values.
In recent months, as we know, there has been a considerable increase in attacks on secularism, particularly with the wearing of religious dress, such as abayas. In the face of occasional blows, attacks, and attempts at destabilization, we must and will stand united. Standing together means being clear. The abaya has no place in our schools.
Up until now, abayas, a long, baggy garment popular in the Middle East, face no outright ban in France. This after the wearing of religious symbols like crosses, kippas and headscarves were banned from schools in 2004. Teachers' unions say they're waiting for more details on how the ban will be enforced.
We'll be paying close attention to how this applies to school principals. Because if you have an extremely tough posture, you risk pupils leaving public education and taking refuge in private education.
French Muslim groups insist abayas are not religious symbols, but the government has nevertheless been in the crosshairs of lawmakers on the right and far right in France. The ban is likely to face hurdles, with school authorities left to decide if a long flowing dress is considered a religious symbol or is simply just fashion.
Yeah, and that first challenge is coming as early as Tuesday, when a French high court will examine a claim against the directive. Rim Sarah Alouane, what's your prediction? Will the ban stand?
Well, it's the burkini season is over, so here we go all over again. It's very hard to say. I would say that on a legal level, such a blanket general ban is extremely weak. I'm actually worrying about the implementation because the state is deeming it religious, even though it's not its role. And you cannot implement such a ban without implementing racial profiling as well. Because will a non-Muslim wearing a maxi dress bought in the same retailer as a Muslim one will be prevent him from wearing it? Is it an abaya depending on the origin of the person or the supposed religion? It's extremely weak, and I think we don't have any Council of State decision on that precise matter. And I think the middle ground we try to be found by the Council of State, but it's extremely weak on the legal level.
Gabriel Attanzo?
Well, I'm not sure it's that complicated. I feel like if there's a doubt, the rule when you work in a high school, if you're not sure what to do, the benefit goes to the student. Say you're hesitant whether or not that student should have 12 or 14 for a grade. Well then, if you have any doubt, well then the benefit goes to the student. I think it's the same here. If you meet a student who's wearing something that might not be religious, then it's not. And that's simply the issue. My stance on that question is that it's a necessity. It's a fairly good rule, but it's not very effective. That's my problem with it. I could explain it to you.
Yeah, but well, we heard the education minister, and we'll hear a clip of him a little bit later on. He said that the first thing that's going to happen in any case is they're going to sit down with the students before banning them, and it's going to. He says it's not going to be as draconian as it sounds.
Sure.
Is it though stigmatization as spelled out by Rimsara?
I mean, it doesn't take much for us to pay attention to public discourse in France and realize that there is a lot of Islamophobia. It's fairly obvious. Who's denying it? I'm not. I certainly am not. Now, when it comes to that law, the issue is it's not so much what we tell kids not to do, it's how we get them to think that we're part of a bigger team. We've had that conversation here with you regarding secularism in France. And I think quite often the conversation is, what should kids not do? And my personal experience, having taught a student who was wearing an abaya for a couple of years, actually, it was not so much what we were telling her when it comes to how she dresses. The real effective measure was to get her to understand the true nature of French ideals. We are a republic that believes in equality.
So just explain this for our viewers. You had kids in your class who wore the abaya.
Just one.
And so what happened?
We talked to her. We have. I mean, that issue didn't. I mean, it's fairly recent. It happened 3-4 years ago, right? And we talked to her, and of course, it was religious. The intent was clear because her intent was to display it, to advertise it. So there was no doubt to have. We talked to her, and we've had long, I think, healthy conversations where it was so much. The conversation was much more. What is it? Why do schools not want expressions of personal faith? Something I've realized. I taught in Seine-Saint-Denis, so a fairly popular neighborhood, from 2015 until 2022, and you would have over the years more and more students say, if we ever mention, say, homosexuals, they would say, oh, this is against the will of God. And these are things that you started to hear more and more. And my role was not to punish. My role was to tell them, okay, here's how we look at this issue in France. And the classroom is a place where you have a right to fail, you have a right to make mistakes, you have the right to say something offensive even. But my role is to say, here are our values, and here's why we defend everyone, and here's why we believe in equality, if that makes any sense.
Rimsara, I just want to, before I turn to the other panelists, to talk about, there was a poll last week. It showed 71% thought the abaya ban was either a very good or fairly good decision. Only 16% disapproved. And then as to the question, which has been floated, as to whether or not it's a cultural or religious sign, according to that same poll, it was done for BFM TV by the Institute El Abbé, 61% of the French said yes, it is a religious symbol. The abaya, is it a recent issue, the abaya in schools, or is it something that's been long-standing?
First of all, I would say I would be careful with polls because just 1 week ago, nobody knew really what an abaya, or very few people knew exactly what an abaya was or even spell the name. So it's also part of this communication and outcry that has been over talked about instead of focusing on real issue. Regarding the abaya, I repeat again, when it comes to separation of church and state, it is not the role of the state to decide what is religious or not. You refer to religious authorities. And if I'm not mistaken, very recently, the main Muslim organization, like in France, said that the abaya was more cultural item. So my fear is, where do we stop? Because once you open such a Pandora box, anything can be religious, really. Do henna tattoos born after the celebration of Eid or weddings will be deemed religious? What about baggy pants? Because, okay, we prohibit abaya, fair enough. What about girls who will rebel themselves, they're teenagers after all, and will wear baggy pants? So every time we have to refer, and again, I'm talking from the from a legal perspective here in civil liberties. Where do we stop?
It's difficult. Let's listen to a clip of one girl who did wear the abaya in the past in Lyon's working class neighborhood of La Duchère. 15-year-old Yara. It was her first day of year 10, seconde in French. She feels stigmatized by the ban.
My school counsellor last year, I would put a dress on. It wasn't even that long. It was just a dress that went down to my knees with tights and leggings underneath, and she would catch me and always say, "Take that off." And so there were times when I was just wearing something that covered me or loose-fitting jeans because she knew I wore the veil. She would say that. Whereas those that didn't wear the veil and people who weren't Muslim, well, she didn't say anything to them.
Alexis Artaud de la Ferrière, your reaction listening to 15-year-old Yara?
So I think that this whole situation is it's the latest step in a longer trend whereby France has moved away from a historical understanding of laïcité as being centered in the principles enunciated in the law of 1905. So freedom of conscience, freedom of religious expression in Article 1, and separation of church and state in Article 2. The Constitutional Council identified those as being the kind of guiding principles for when the Constitution identifies the Republic as laïque. Since 2004, there's been a more Jacobinist, a more restrictivist interpretation of laïcité that has encroached in the legal sphere and which generates these problems, which is increasingly the burden of neutrality is shifted from the state to the individual, and now we have to police in more and more granular detail the activities, the symbols, and the dress of individuals within institutions like state schools.
Yeah, let's look over the. I see Gabriel shaking his head. We'll get to you in a moment. Look over the letter, just to be clear, the letter of the law. It was a law passed in 2004, and it says it is forbidden by state primary, middle, and high schools for students to wear symbols or attire by which pupils conspicuously display a religious affiliation. Your thoughts on that law? Was that already, Alexis, straying from the spirit of French-style secularism as you described it?
Well, what it manifests is it's one tendency, a more Jacobinist, a more Napoleonic tendency, a more restrictivist tendency, which has taken a dominant role over a more liberal tendency, which had been dominant in the jurisprudence up until that point. So whether that's right or wrong, I personally am uncomfortable with it, but that's up to the body politic to decide. But it's clearly, 2004 is clearly a shifting point in terms of, at least politically and legally, how that principle has been interpreted and enforced in France.
Jeremy Stubbs?
Well, I think states have the right to make new laws and to reinterpret old ones. Laïcité, we know, is not a straightforward subject. It's constantly evolving. It can be interpreted differently in different contexts. The important thing is that, especially in this case, teachers and pupils need clarity. Now, they weren't getting it from the previous Minister of Education, who, like some of his predecessors, tried to pass the buck down to heads of schools, which put a lot of extra burden, I think, on them. So at the very least, this decision by the new minister has brought that clarity. People say, oh, it's going to be a disaster. We won't be able to tell one dress from another dress. Similar prophecies were made before the banning of the veil or headscarf in schools, but that seemed to pass off okay, not without, some incidents, that's for sure, but it's by and large has generally worked. And this only applies to school. The abaya is, you can wear it on the way to school, you can wear it in public, you can demonstrate your cultural affinities, but school is a place of a certain authority, a very benevolent authority, as Gabrielle has said, and it's not unusual that people in authority should make such decisions about what goes on in the classroom.
Rim Sarah Alwan?
Of course, laws involved, but as the other panelists said, laicity has been weaponized since the 90s. If you read the debates when the law of 1905 was adopted, the restrictive version of separation of church and state, the combiste from Émile Combes, was firmly rejected. And really, the idea was to guarantee freedom of religion, freedom of conscience, freedom to believe, to not believe, and so on and so forth. And what we are doing goes against the very liberal essence of laicite. And may I add as well that we are signatory to international conventions and treaties which guarantee freedom of religion, including for children. And
but you just heard Jeremy Stubbs say that you have freedom of religion, but in the classroom there are codes and dress codes.
Since 2004, but again, how do you describe legally conspicuous? Because I think, sorry, I will end with that. And of course, teachers are in a way better place to talk about it. But I also think that by giving that burden to teachers, it takes them out of their neutrality duty as well. And I think a liberal compromise must be found, because I do not think it's sustainable. And what will happen is that many Muslim students, especially, will eventually leave public schools to go to private ones. Is it what we want for the Republic?
Gabriela Tanzo, is this more or less pressure on teachers, this directive?
Sure. There's so much on the shoulders of teachers. But I would
does this add to the pressure, or does it
Sure, but I mean, it's not so much...
Because you heard Jeremy argue that it reduces it, and that you have a clear directive coming from...
Well, that decision by Gabriel Attal, yes. In a way, it says, look, it's the rule for everyone, so it's not so much an interpersonal relationship. Now, I'm very surprised as to every comment we make regarding the history of France. So if I'm listening correctly to previous people today, we're saying, oh, France used to be liberal, in the English meaning of the term, and we're turning Jacobins. So I'm very confused. I don't think that's the way it went. I don't think that liberalism was such a strong political current in 1905, and I don't think that Jacobins today are stronger than they were before. Now, I'll tell you something that is a little bit more pragmatic. We all draw the line somewhere. We all draw the line somewhere. When it comes to religious practice in school or religious expression in school, everyone, and I mean every single person, draws the line somewhere. For some people, it's going to be whether or not you can pray, whether or not you will have religious offices, or if you'll have a priest attached to the school, etc., and so on. Well, someone asked earlier, look, you wouldn't ban baggy jeans. No, I would not. I'm telling you, I would ban explicitly religious clothing. That's it. That's it. And why is that an issue? It's because when you are in a place where you learn, you need to be careful as to the freedom that teachers have to express scientific beliefs. And that is sometimes an issue even today.
It's there is one solution, and that was brought up by the education minister when he was asked about it on Breakfast Radio this Monday. The concept, which is foreign to state schools in this country, of school uniforms.
L'expérimentation, elle va se faire ou pas?
I've spoken to a number of teachers, elected officials and families who often propose this to me. I'm not sure it's a miracle solution that will resolve all problems in schools. I'm very much in favor of an experiment so that we can move forward in the debates. I see that some elected officials have taken a stance on the question of uniform in recent days. I invite these officials to get in touch with me to propose the establishments in which they want to trial school uniforms. In autumn, I will announce how exactly the experiment will work.
Well, I'll turn to the resident expert in wearing school uniforms, Jeremy Stubbs. I suppose you were scarred by having to wear them every day as a pupil?
Yes, I wore a school uniform every day, but it wasn't a scar. I think it was an advantage. I even went to a school where there was a priest attached, and we had religious services 4 days out of 5.
Was it a state school, though?
No.
Okay.
No.
Just to be
But, in France, religious schools are under contract to the government for the most part, so they can't do just anything they like anyway. But wearing uniform it's a very good thing in Britain.
Do you see the French doing it?
That is more difficult for two reasons. Firstly, it is perceived. I mean, the two people who've been talking about this have been the Eric Ciotti of the
Conservative Republican
Republicans
Party
and the independent right-wing MP, Emmanuel Ménard. And it's an issue that is perceived as a kind of right-wing measure. So I'm not sure if that would go down well in France. Maybe I'm wrong. The other thing is an economic one. There is always a debate about whether buying possibly subsidized school uniforms is cheaper than having to buy clothes.
I know for our viewers in Africa, it's an issue at every back to school, how to pay for the kids' school uniforms.
Yes, and in Britain at the moment, in many cases, there has to be subsidies to cover part of the cost. So it's a complex debate. It's not going to be a simple measure. Let's introduce the uniform and all these problems about abayas and the rest will go away. That's why everyone's only ever talking of an experiment here.
Rimsara Alwan, would this solve the problem of putting the cost aside, obviously? Would it solve the problem?
I think the whole debate is a distraction, really.
Uniforms would be a distraction.
That I agree.
Is it really the priority? I mean, first you were talking about budget, and rightly so. We don't have enough teachers. Our public school system is falling apart, and we are talking about experimenting uniforms as if magically it will erase inequalities. Okay, maybe at school, and what happened after? Will it allow kids in poor suburbs to access les grandes écoles eventually because they wear a uniform? I mean, it's all a distraction from the real issues. And is it really the priority to talk about that? We literally are failing our teachers and our system. And the first thing we talk about is the uniform, really. I mean...
Sitting in London, Alexis Artaud de la Ferrière, how does the question of experimenting with school uniforms in France seem to you?
Yeah, I think the uniforms issue is a canard. My children wear a uniform in England. I don't have anything against it, but that doesn't get to the issue here. The issue here is about the respect of fundamental rights and about how to govern an increasingly pluralistic society. So, the uniform question doesn't resolve that, because even if you impose a uniform, you still have to ask the question, can we modify the uniform to conform with certain religious practices, as is done in England, for example? It's not just an issue in schools. The full face veil is banned in France in public spaces. Since 2016, there are increasing restrictions on religious expressions in the workplace. The 2021 law on the respect of values of the Republic has imposed massive bureaucratic impositions on religious organizations, has increased their overheads, their costs. There's an issue in France. It's not that France is alone here in dealing with this issue of the respect for religious liberty, but France, in a particular way, needs to deal with this issue of how to respond to its population's well-founded desire to express themselves.
Okay, so then in that case, let me ask you, Alexis, that poll I referred to earlier, it said that 55% of supporters of the hard left's leader, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, were in favor of this abaya ban. 55%, what does that tell you?
I think it tells me that there's discomfort with the topic of religiosity in France, increasingly in Western societies more generally. Religiosity, and Islam in particular, is seen as something suspicious, something potentially violent. Now, we do know that there are excesses. Islamic terrorism isn't a fantasy, but that is a very small proportion of a much larger population which is trying to organize their lives around moral principles, who are trying to find a way to conduct themselves according to their conscience.
Gabriel Atanzio.
Right. So I am glad that the way you frame the issues to say that when it comes to school, and I agree with a couple of people just before, that when it comes to school, if you truly believe in what you're saying, say the issue is to build French cohesion, to make sure that kids feel like they're part of the team, they're part of the national team. Well, then it's not down to the rules you tell them to follow. It's also down to the services that you provide. Myself, like others, I have dedicated my career, most of my time, to making sure that we give the same teaching to all kids in France. And I truly believe that, but I don't think politicians do. I don't think politicians care at all, neither on the left, nor on the right, nor on the extremes, nowhere. The true issue is not so much what you tell them not to do, but what you make them believe they can achieve themselves. And it's not just a matter of mindset, it's truly what you teach them. The service that I provide for the past 15 years, it's getting worse. And no one is courageous enough to say it. No one is courageous enough to say it. It's not so much that we say the wrong thing. It's that we're not enough in numbers to tell students, okay, here's what you should know. It's also that we are having a harder time to get them to achieve even the most simple skills. Writing, reading, just get them to enjoy doing it. This is something that drives me mad. I've been here before. I find myself being heated today. I just don't think that kids read enough. And I don't think that you can just say to kids, you should read. We should make them understand why they should. And you can't do that when you don't have enough teachers. That's key. And in that regard, no one's providing a solution. No one.
No one's providing a solution. And there is a context, especially with this back to school that we're seeing. Working class neighborhoods have pressing issues we've talked about, like the shortage of teachers and how to heal wounds within the community. In the Bordeaux suburb of Lormont, it was a summer of rebuilding after the Condorcet primary school was vandalized during last June and July's riots against police brutality.
This is a school that was badly damaged during the riots, and if it hadn't been for the joint efforts of the local authority and the teaching staff, the pupils wouldn't have been able to go back to kindergarten, so it's very satisfying.
So they did have their first day of school. Rimsa Alwan, your thoughts on this issue, because we do hear politicians from all sides talking about investing more in education and the pride that's felt in it. By the way, it's 1.2 million people who work in education in France. It's a huge number. And yet, here we've had young people who vandalized schools during those riots.
I have heard that conversation for years, and I agree with what has been said previously. The state just doesn't care. Those are effects of announcements. When you see that some working class neighbors don't have enough teachers to teach the basics, when you see at university, and I have witnessed it, the difference of level you have between schools from nice suburbs and schools from more deprived ones, it's mind-blowing and not in a good way. So my question is, do we want a public service that works, or do we just want to make it into a business that basically make us save money or whatever? We reach a point when we have to do some sort of like job dating to hire teachers. That's the situation we are in. And when we talk about being vandalized, of course, I do not condone violence. Violence is bad, whatever. But you need to understand the frustration behind. When people are not heard, when the people who are supposed to represent us, represent them, are completely ignoring, violence sometimes is the least resort to use to be heard. And that's actually extremely sad and very dangerous as well.
This unwinding of between the haves and have-nots, France, its education system has always come in for a lot of criticism, but one of its pride and joys was a primary education system that was well seen across the globe. This problem of lack of teachers, of a sort of a social cohesion that's unwinding, hence the entrenched lines, Jeremy Stubbs, on things like what you wear to school.
Yes, well, Part of this announcement about what you wear at school is supposed, I think, to be part of the government's new approach announced this summer, which is to restore authority. In all sectors of life, authority will be restored. And I think this is a classic case of fine words with small actions. You can't just rhetorically restore authority. It's a very, very complex business. I don't think that the violence we saw directed at schools.
And when they say restore authority, is that just a dog whistle message to court votes for from the far right?
It might be, but let's not presume to know what is in people's minds. Probably these politicians believe it. And there is a real need to restore authority of some kind in very many sectors. The question is, can they actually do it? And I think this question of the abaya will be a kind of battleground where different people will be able to show that the government can or cannot do it. So in some ways, it will indeed be a distraction. But restoring authority, if that was Monsieur Macron's program, he should have started in 2017 at the very latest, because I can't see it being restored by the time he leaves office in the time available.
Restoring authority. Your thoughts on that, Gabriel Latanzio?
It's going to take forever. It's going to take a while. If there is one topic one issue that you can solve by just, acting on one factor, that would be it. I have felt myself lacking authority. It's happened before. I mean, in 2022, when I eventually left the high school I worked at, I did so because I was in danger myself. So it's a complex business. I don't mean to tell that story, but yes, authority is an issue. Now, can you address it by just mentioning it? No way. It's down to the beliefs that people have, parents and teachers, as to how you best serve kids. It's how you're best useful to them. It's down to how much value is put into education. And I don't think that the current reforms that are promised, the reforms that are promised we'll have teachers who will do that job for a handful of years, maybe 5 to 10 years. Do you really think you can be authoritative in your job when it's going to take you 5 years to figure out what it is like to handle a classroom of rowdy kids? It takes a while. And the plan now, people should know, the current government is hoping to do two things. First, they want teachers to become a job that you do for a short while during your career, for 10 years, no authority there. And the second thing they want to do is transform national education into regional education. Well, let me tell you, this is Pandora's box. Because if there's one thing that we should be proud of in France, is that if we want to carry out a politics towards kids, we can do it nationwide. And they want to get rid of that? Nightmare.
Alexis Artaud de la Ferrière, you were ruining at the beginning of this conversation the Jacobin tendencies of the French state, top-down authority. What's your reaction to what Gabriel Latanzio said about the need to have a national cohesion when it comes to education policy?
National cohesion is one thing. Centralized directives is another. And I understand if heads of schools are asking for clarity in a context where they have to litigate against rather ambiguous signs and dress codes. But again, it's a situation which has arisen because the state started to enforce these restrictions to begin with in 2004. Now, if there's a Pandora's box, I think it's that attempt to restrict and to regulate the practices and the dress codes of students in the first place. We were talking about authority. Authority requires rules and laws, absolutely. But one of the things that undermines authority is the inability of either the legislator or the teacher to actually implement those rules and those laws which have been passed. And one of the things I think that we're dealing with now is we just have a surfeit of regulations, rules, restrictions, which can't practically be enforced day to day, and that erodes the legitimacy and the authority of the public institutions. It doesn't do anything.
And how does that compare to Britain, where you are right now?
So in the UK, UK has a very decentralized education policy. All of the constituent nations set their own education policy. in terms of religious expressions in state-funded schools, there's very little, if any, restrictions, and those restrictions which would exist are on a case-by-case basis. It doesn't it doesn't give rise to great debate and great, wringing of hands in the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom isn't an ideal place. It's not a utopia. I'm not saying that France should look to the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom has its own problems in terms of religious liberty, which it should be considering. But in the case of what children wear in schools, how people can express themselves through their clothing religiously in the public space, I think the United Kingdom has kind of resolved that issue in a healthier way than France.
Gabriel Atanzio, I ask you as opposed to the other panelists because you were the one who taught in high schools. This is again at the heart of the question that everybody outside of France always asks when they see these debates. Why not let and this has been since 1989 when the education minister was 6 months old, when there was the first time that there was a ban on a girl wearing a veil in school. Why is it like this in France?
I'm not sure I know enough about the Brits to answer that question. I was in Scotland a couple of weeks ago and I visited the University of Glasgow and it was magnificent. Hogwarts in real life. And I visited, and you had religious services offered there. And, as a tourist, one in Rome, do as the Romans do, one in Glasgow, I did as the Glaswegian. And I thought, well, look, this is beautiful. And there was no hostility on my part. Now, going back to the Sorbonne, let me tell you, I am not in favor for us to reestablish, the religious services that used to be provided there. Now, people are free to wear the veil when they go to universities, thank God. People are free to wear any religious thing they want as they're adults, thank God. When it comes to kids, my belief is that we share a little bit of that responsibility. I do not think that children are strictly the responsibility of their parents. I think largely it is. But I think to some extent in France, maybe elsewhere as well, we think that we are the product of the hundreds of adults that took care of us at some point, right? And when myself, I talk to kids about, say, the use of the word gender in England or the US. And I have kids who say, oh, this is haram. This is not something that should be mentioned. This is against the will of God. Well, my job is to say, leave religion out of my classroom. You are free to make that comment, but my answer is we're going to talk about gender, for instance, or homophobia or whatever, in the way we do here in France. And your speech is welcome, always welcome. You're free to say whatever you want. But my role is to say homophobia is illegal here, and you can't justify it with old texts.
And what about pupils who say, I don't want to go to gym class for religious reasons?
Well, they should go. I mean...
They should go. Rimsara Alouane, your thoughts?
On the gym part, or
just more broadly? Well, you can happy to weigh in on gym.
No, I mean, joke aside, more broadly, as a general comment, what I fear is how the country of human rights and the country of freedom, like there was a time when we said that freedom is the principle and exceptions to freedoms, restrictions are the exceptions. And it has been quite some time now, probably something like 30 years since, and not just with religious freedom, really civil liberties as a whole, where the restrictions to freedom become the principle and freedom the exception. Is it a country we want to? I think that France has a problem with change. France has a problem, is in denial with the fact that it's becoming a diverse country. For its best, we are an interconnected country, globalized, open to the world. And I think there's still a part of maybe the establishment who still don't accept the fact that the world is changing. So, of course, we need to keep our values that we abide by, like the Republic, the French values, like the heritage of the revolution, if you want. But we also need to understand that the world is changing. And it means more freedom. It means respecting also our diversity. And that's something we don't know how to do well. And I think we are struggling with that.
Jeremy Stubbs, you agree the world's become a smaller place and the French, their concept of laïcité, of secularism, is just going against the grain of what's going on everywhere around them?
Well, not necessarily at all. I mean, if you look at very many countries in this world, they do not have anything like the liberty or the religious freedom that we have in countries like France, the USA, or the UK. We should remember that. As to the difference between the apparent pluralism of the UK and the apparent sort of homogenizing tendency in France, it's a question of tradition and culture. The UK has long had that kind of tradition. So people know, without even being told, something of how they should behave. In France, the tradition, which is a long-standing tradition, which may come from the revolution, or it may indeed come before that from the kings and queens, but that is part of France. Now, you can say, well, you've got to make some concessions to modernity. Okay. But there comes a point where you lose your own nature. You lose the very tradition that keeps you going. And therefore, I think that France, even though it's a very different culture from my own, I think it should stick to its guns.
Alexis Artaud de la Ferrière, I'm old enough, because I have gray hair, to remember 1989 and the huge debates at the time that took place in this country and that drew worldwide attention over stopping those little girls from going to school with their veil on. It doesn't feel like this argument is very different from back then.
No, unfortunately, this argument gets rehashed every couple of years. It's certainly in part a response to the increasing diversification of France. In some way, it must be a response to the proximity between France and North Africa. But also, I think it's the expression of a historic conflict within France, at least since the revolution, which is between a liberal tradition, and the liberal tradition is not some sort of foreign import. It's not a foreign trend that France should maybe conform to. It's ingrained within its own tradition. You know, Aristide Briand, François de Pressenay, Tocqueville. You have a whole tradition of French statesmen and French philosophers who are thinking about the central place of individual liberty and the dignity of the person in crafting the state. Aristide Briand wrote about the law of 1905. He said, whenever the future legislators are going to look at the text, where they find silence in the text, they should interpret it in the favor of liberty. And that's not a foreign imposition. That's not an Anglo-Saxon imperialism. That's an indigenous tradition within France. And France needs to remember that it has an indigenous tradition.
That it has that tradition. Oh, the Skype is starting to die. That's a sign for us, perhaps, to unfortunately wind it down, because there's so much more to ask about. I want to thank you, Alexis Artaud de la Ferrière, for joining us from London. Rimsara Alouane in Toulouse. I want to thank as well Jeremy Stubbs, Gabriel Latanzio. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.